The courthouse buzzed with the usual morning chaos, the rhythmic clatter of heels against the marble floor, the murmur of attorneys flipping through legal briefs, and the occasional echo of a gavel striking wood, all blended into the familiar symphony of justice in motion. Jessica Carter took a deep breath as she stepped toward the main entrance, her leather briefcase firm in her grip. She had walked through these doors countless times, yet today there was an unsettling air about the place. The weight of the judicial robes she had left in her chambers felt heavier than usual, though they weren't even on her shoulders. As she approached the security checkpoint, a towering officer with a buzz cut and a rigid stance stepped forward. His name tag read Daniels. Jessica barely had time to acknowledge him before he extended an arm, halting her in her tracks. "Hold up. You need to wait outside." His tone was flat, uninterested, almost dismissive. Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm yet firm. Daniels gave her a quick once-over, his gaze flickering from her navy blazer to her neatly styled hair. He didn't ask for an ID. He didn't ask for a reason. Instead, he sighed impatiently, as if she were a minor inconvenience. "Only attorneys and court officials are allowed in without clearance. You'll have to wait until your name is called." Jessica's brows furrowed. In the past 2 minutes she had seen at least 5 people enter without being stopped. Some in casual attire, others with no visible identification. Yet here she was, being told to wait. She took a step forward, standing her ground. "I do have business inside," she stated, enunciating each word clearly. Daniel's smirk was subtle but unmistakable. "Sure you do," he muttered, barely trying to mask his condescension. A slow, sharp heat rose in Jessica's chest, but she kept her composure. She had spent years maintaining her poise in courtrooms, facing down defense attorneys who underestimated her, judges who questioned her rulings, and bureaucrats who doubted her expertise. But this was something different. Her voice remained level. "Why are you assuming I don't belong here?" Daniels sighed dramatically, shifting his weight onto one foot as if bored with the conversation. "Look, we get all kinds of people trying to get in here early. Defendants, witnesses, folks who think they can just walk in. If you're supposed to be inside, you'll be called." The implication was clear. She wasn't one of the people he assumed had legitimate business in this courthouse. Jessica exhaled slowly, choosing her next words carefully. "And what, exactly, makes you so sure I'm not supposed to be here?" Daniels crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Because I know who belongs and who doesn't." A quiet tension hung in the air. The murmur of the crowd behind them faded as nearby observers sensed something wasn't right. Jessica had spent her career fighting for fairness in the justice system, but in that moment, she wasn't just fighting for justice in a courtroom. She was fighting for the right to even step inside. Jessica Carter stood her ground, her heart pounding with restrained frustration. She wasn't a stranger to being underestimated, but this was different. This wasn't a courtroom where she could methodically dismantle an argument. This was a silent accusation. An assumption made in an instant, without question, without evidence. Officer Daniels still had that smug smirk on his face, arms crossed over his chest as if daring her to argue. She inhaled deeply. "I just watched 5 people walk in without being stopped. What makes them different from me?" Daniels barely reacted. Instead, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "I know who belongs here. I've been doing this job for years." Jessica's jaw tightened. That statement wasn't just arrogant, it was revealing. He had made a decision about her the moment she stepped forward, and it had nothing to do with protocol. She could feel the eyes on her now. People in the crowd were slowing down, glancing her way. Some seemed uncomfortable, sensing the underlying tension, but no one spoke. No one challenged what was happening. Jessica took a step closer, keeping her voice controlled. "And what exactly about me tells you I don't belong. Daniels tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response, but the smugness never left his expression. Look, we get all kinds of people trying to sneak in. Defendants, witnesses, people who think they can just walk in whenever they want. If you have official business, you'll be called. Simple as that. His voice was casual, dismissive, as if he were explaining the rules to a child. Jessica folded her arms across her chest. You didn't check my ID. Daniels raised an eyebrow. You didn't ask for my name, she continued, voice calm but sharp. You didn't ask why I was here. You just told me to wait. Daniels shrugged. Like I said, I know who belongs. The weight of his words hung in the air. Jessica could feel her pulse in her ears. Years of experience told her to choose her battles, to weigh the consequences of every confrontation, but this wasn't something she could let pass. Still, she wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking she was just another person trying to make a scene. Instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her posture, locking eyes with him. You're making a mistake. Daniels let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. I don't think so. Then, with a smirk, he added, But you do whatever you think is best, sweetheart. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jessica's fingers twitched at her side. The condescension in his voice, the blatant dismissal, the way he had looked right through her as if she were insignificant. It was enough to make her blood run hot. She wasn't going to let this go, and she wasn't going to let him win. The tension in the air was undeniable. Jessica Carter could feel the weight of every stare pressing against her back. Conversations hushed. Footsteps slowed, and the hum of the courthouse seemed to fade under the pressure of the moment. People were watching, but no one was speaking. Jessica held her ground, refusing to look away from Officer Daniels. I've been standing here for 2 minutes, she said, her voice unwavering, and I've counted at least 5 people who walked in without you stopping them. Daniels let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly growing impatient. I already told you. I know who belongs here. Jessica arched an eyebrow. And what exactly makes you so confident in that? Daniels smirked, his arms still crossed over his chest. It's obvious the way people carry themselves, who looks like they know where they're going, who actually fits in. Jessica felt the heat rising in her chest. His words were unspoken, yet their meaning was crystal clear. She exhaled, keeping her composure. You mean the ones who look like you? Daniel's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He straightened his shoulders, doubling down. I don't have time for this, he muttered. You can either wait outside or security can escort you out. Jessica's fingers curled into her palm. She could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she wouldn't let it control her. She had spent years mastering the ability to remain composed under pressure, but she was also done being silent. Lifting her chin slightly, she stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so only Daniels could hear. Tell me something, officer, she said smoothly. What happens when the person you think doesn't belong is the one in charge? Daniel's smirk finally faded. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with forced indifference. I don't play games, he snapped. Jessica let a slow smile touch the corners of her lips. Neither do I. A shift rippled through the crowd. Whispers started up again, people murmuring among themselves. Some pulled out their phones. Others exchanged glances, realizing that whatever was happening wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that demanded attention. Jessica had spent her career ensuring that justice wasn't just about what happened inside a courtroom. It was about how people were treated before they even stepped inside. And right now, justice had been denied at the door. She wasn't going to let that stand. The tension had reached a boiling point. The quiet murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, an undercurrent of unease running through the crowd. People were no longer simply observing, they were waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Jessica Carter could feel her pulse in her ears. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. But she had spent her entire career standing firm in the face of injustice. This was no different. Before she could speak again, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" A second officer approached. Sergeant Mitchell. His presence immediately changed the dynamic. Unlike Daniels, Mitchell was older, his expression less rigid, his demeanor more measured. He glanced between Jessica and Daniels, assessing the situation. Daniels rolled his eyes. "She's refusing to wait outside." His voice was laced with irritation, as if this was nothing more than a nuisance. Sergeant Mitchell turned his attention to Jessica. "Ma'am, may I have your name?" His voice was firm but not dismissive. Jessica lifted her chin. "Jessica Carter." Mitchell nodded. "And your business here today?" Jessica inhaled slowly, then delivered the words with deliberate clarity. "I have a meeting with the chief judge." The impact was instant. A ripple of realization passed through the crowd. A few audible gasps escaped from those who had been listening closely. Daniels let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, ha ha ha, that's a good one," he scoffed. "If you had a meeting with the chief judge, you wouldn't be standing here arguing with me." Jessica remained silent, watching him. Then, with deliberate precision, she reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder. She flipped it open, revealing an official document embossed with the United States District Court seal. Judge Jessica Carter. The name was printed in bold, undeniable letters. Sergeant Mitchell straightened immediately. His entire demeanor shifted. "Judge Carter, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding," he said quickly. "Please, go right in." Daniels, meanwhile, had gone pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by an unmistakable look of disbelief. Jessica held his gaze, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Then, in a voice steady and sharp, she spoke. "I told you," she said. "You were making a mistake." And with that she stepped forward, past Daniels, past the stairs, past the whispers. She wasn't just entering the courthouse. She was reclaiming her place. A heavy silence hung in the air as Jessica Carter walked past Officer Daniels, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Conversations halted, heads turned, and people who had only moments ago been indifferent were now fully invested in what had just transpired. Daniel, still frozen in place, watched as Jessica walked toward the main entrance of the courthouse. His face was a mask of disbelief, his usual arrogance replaced by stunned silence. He had been so certain, so dismissive, and now he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. As Jessica stepped inside, the whispers followed her. "Did you hear that? She's a judge." He tried to stop a judge from entering the courthouse. Unbelievable. Jessica didn't need to turn around to know that the scene behind her was unraveling. Daniels was likely still standing there, his authority shaken in a way he had never experienced before, and the onlookers, some recording, some shaking their heads, would remember this moment long after the day was over. She straightened her shoulders and walked through the grand hall, her eyes scanning for the one person she was here to meet. Then a familiar voice called out, "There you are, Judge Carter. I was beginning to think something had delayed you." Jessica turned to see Judge Robert Hamilton, one of the most respected senior judges in the courthouse. His expression was warm, but as he took in her face, his brows furrowed slightly. Jessica forced a small smile. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Hamilton studied her for a moment before glancing toward the entrance, where a small crowd was still lingering. His jaw tightened, his experienced eyes piecing together what had happened without her needing to explain. He exhaled sharply. "I assume this misunderstanding is something I should be aware of." Jessica hesitated for only a moment before nodding. It seems some people still need to be reminded that justice doesn't begin inside the courtroom. It starts the moment someone walks through those doors. Judge Hamilton's expression darkened. He gave a sharp nod and turned to a nearby bailiff. "Make sure I get a report on what just happened at security." Jessica appreciated the swift response, but she wasn't here for personal apologies or damage control. She had a job to do, one that went beyond a single confrontation at the courthouse doors. Still, she knew this moment wouldn't be forgotten. As she followed Judge Hamilton toward the judge's chambers, the whispers and glances continued. But now the looks weren't of doubt. They were of recognition. Jessica Carter wasn't just a woman fighting for her right to enter. She was a judge. And after today, everyone in that courthouse would remember her name. As Jessica Carter followed Judge Hamilton down the grand hallway, she could still feel the weight of lingering stares. The moment outside had passed, but its impact was just beginning. Hamilton led her into the judge's chambers, a spacious office lined with bookshelves stacked high with legal volumes. He gestured for her to take a seat, but before either of them could settle in, a court officer knocked on the door and stepped inside, his expression tense. "Judge Hamilton." "Judge Carter," he addressed them respectfully. "There's already talk about what happened downstairs. A few staff members witnessed it and, well, let's just say, word is spreading fast." Jessica exchanged a glance with Hamilton. She had expected the moment to cause a stir, but this was spreading quicker than she anticipated. Hamilton sighed, rubbing his temple. "I assume the chief judge will hear about it soon." The officer nodded, likely by the end of the hour. Jessica kept her expression neutral, but inside she knew this was bigger than just her experience. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. This was about the culture within the courthouse. If she, a federal judge, could be stopped and dismissed at the door, what did that say about how others were treated? Hamilton turned his full attention to her. "Are you planning to take action on this?" Jessica leaned forward slightly, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong here. The fact that this happened in a place meant to uphold justice makes it all the more unacceptable." Hamilton nodded. "Then we make sure it's addressed." Before they could continue, another knock interrupted them. This time, it was Chief Judge Moore, a commanding presence with years of experience behind her sharp gaze. She stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Judge Carter," she greeted, her tone professional but edged with concern. "I just heard about what happened." Jessica stood, meeting the Chief Judge's gaze. "Then I assume you know why this isn't something we can ignore." Moore nodded. "I do, and I assure you, we won't." She took a seat across from them, folding her hands over the desk. "There will be an immediate review of our security training and procedures, and mandatory racial bias training for all courthouse personnel, including officers like Daniels." Jessica exhaled slowly. It was a step in the right direction, but policies alone wouldn't change a culture. That would take time. That would take people holding each other accountable. Hamilton spoke next. "This courthouse should set the standard for fairness, not reinforce the biases we claim to fight against." Jessica nodded in agreement. "And it starts at the door." Moore gave a firm nod. "Then we make sure no one forgets that." As the meeting ended, Jessica knew this was just the beginning. The system wouldn't change overnight, but today a conversation had started, one that no one could ignore. As Jessica Carter walked out of the judge's chambers, the courthouse felt different. The murmur of conversation still lingered, but there was something else in the air. Awareness. People who had been mere bystanders earlier now looked at her with something beyond curiosity. There was recognition. She descended the grand staircase, her posture steady, her heels clicking against the polished marble. As she reached the lobby, she noticed Sergeant Mitchell standing near the entrance, talking to a group of security officers. When he spotted her, he gave a respectful nod. Nearby, Officer Daniels was no longer standing with his usual air of authority. Instead, he was engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with a superior. His expression was rigid, his jaw tight. The smugness was gone. Jessica didn't linger. She wasn't here to witness Daniel's reckoning. She was here to ensure that change was coming. As she stepped outside, the crisp air filled her lungs, grounding her. The weight of the morning's event still sat heavy on her shoulders, but she knew this moment was bigger than her. Her phone buzzed. A message from Judge Hamilton. The Chief Judge just sent out a formal directive. Mandatory bias training starts next week. Change is happening. Jessica exhaled, a small but meaningful smile touching her lips. She typed a quick response. It's a start, because that's all this was. The start of something long overdue. She had spent her career fighting for justice inside the courtroom, but today she had fought for it before even stepping inside. And she wasn't done yet. What happened to Jessica Carter was more than just a personal slight. It was a reflection of a much larger issue. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the assumptions made, in a split second. The silent barriers that tell some people they don't belong, even in places meant for fairness and justice. But moments like this remind us that change begins when someone refuses to accept the status quo. Jessica didn't just walk into that courthouse. She challenged the very mindset that allowed people like Officer Daniels to operate unchecked. And she didn't just do it for herself. She did it for every person who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told to wait outside when others walk freely in. Justice doesn't start inside a courtroom. It starts at the door. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to stand your ground against bias? What are your thoughts on how institutions can create real, lasting change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have this conversation together. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that challenge the way we see the world. Together we can push for awareness. Together we can demand change. Thank you for being part of this journey.